This is Jeff Zeig. Here I am in Phoenix, Arizona in the library, the offices of the Milton Erickson Foundation. And another story about my time with Milton Erickson. This is the fourth in a series of stories about Milton Erickson. This is December 3rd of 1973. I'm visiting Dr. Erickson, and I explained some of the introduction that happened in earlier episodes. The first story that Dr. Erickson tells me is a story about a psychotic patient when he was working, perhaps in some of his early years, and this psychotic patient was in a locked room of the hospital in which there were bars on the room, like a jail. And the patient was anxiously, fearfully winding string around the iron bars of the room because he knew, in his paranoid way, that his enemies were going to come and get him. And to protect himself even more, he was fearfully winding string around the iron bars of the room. It was a psychotic idea, but had some basis in this man's paranoia. And what did Dr. Erickson do? Well, he went into the room and he helped the man to wind string around the iron bars. And in doing so, he found cracks in the floor and helped the man to stuff the cracks and secure those cracks. And gradually, he was able to help this man so that they could extend, by implication, the idea of protection to him and to the hospital and even to the state of Massachusetts, which I think is where this episode happened. And Erickson was doing one of his residencies at Worcester Hospital in Massachusetts, which was actually a very famous teaching hospital. It was the area where Freud first came when he did his introductory lectures in the United States. So Dr. Erickson helped this man, and the result was the man was able to cease his fruitless endeavors and take ground privileges. Now, at the time, Dr. Erickson knew that I was working with schizophrenic patients, and my job was being a therapist at a halfway house, a residential treatment center, a subacute unit, transitioning people from the county hospital into a halfway house. And so he told me a story about his work with a psychotic patient. The next story that he told me was about Jimmy. And he said that Jimmy suffered from chronic idiocy. I thought he was speaking my experiential language because at the time I thought I was suffering from chronic idiocy too, just being a relatively new psychotherapist as a master's degree marriage and family counselor in California. And Jimmy would walk around the hospital ground picking up treasures. It could be the body of a dead frog or a bottle cap, and he would fill his pocket with treasures, and then he would come back to the ward and they would help him to empty his pockets, and Jimmy would continue this day after day. Well, there was an emergency at the hospital and perhaps a fire, and the staff got a little paralyzed, and suddenly Jimmy sprung into action. Dr. Erickson wasn't at the hospital at the time, and Jimmy helped the attendants to search the rooms, make sure all of the patients at the hospital were safe, brought them to a safe place on the grounds, and then continued his chronic idiocy, picking up treasures. Dr. Erickson said that when he went back to the hospital, he tried to interview Jimmy, find out how it happened that Jimmy suddenly became competent in being more of a human being rather than be robotic in his psychotic fashion, but Jimmy was still the same Jimmy that everybody knew. So that was a second patient that Dr. Erickson told me about, and this patient basically didn't change. The third patient that Dr. Erickson told me about was an incident during World War II where a husband got a 30-day leave to help his wife. And toward the end of that 30 days, not having gotten any help for his wife, they came to Dr. Erickson's office. And Dr. Erickson met with the woman. When she came in, she said 3 things to Dr. Erickson, to which he replied, "Madam, I don't know anyone I hate enough to refer you to for psychotherapy." I was stunned. And what were these 3 things that the woman said? Because I heard Dr. Erickson tell this story more than once. And she said something like, "Your secretary kept me waiting, your office is a mess, and it's making my headache worse." And Dr. Erickson assessed very quickly that this woman had a psychopathic pattern that was locked into place, and she wasn't going to change. And I could query Dr. Erickson, couldn't you use a confusion technique, and couldn't you use storytelling, and couldn't you use the interspersal technique? Until one time he got tired of me asking, couldn't you use, and he said, quite frankly, "Jeff, you're naive. There are some people who abuse psychotherapy, and some people who are not going to change." Now, when I told that story to Jay Haley, he had a different orientation, thinking that if the therapist had a technology, perhaps the technology would be strong enough to help somebody to change. But there were patterns of psychopathy that Dr. Erickson believed were recalcitrant to change. And he told me a more extended story about this client and how this client weaved her way into the hospital where Dr. Erickson was working, and he assigned her to one of his residents, and the first assignment was that she was to write her biography, and the attendants would take away the paper as soon as she had completed a page. And Dr. Erickson gave me the typescript of her biography, which was extensive single-page typescript lasting many pages. He had it typed out by, obviously, a secretary. And he asked me to read that and to understand what would it say on the last page. And I was naive, and I read it, and I didn't understand the pattern until he pointed it out to me. And the pattern was that she would say something positive, something negative, something positive, something negative, something positive, something negative. And I couldn't see that pattern when I read that autobiographical statement. And what did it say at the end of the autobiography? Well, after writing countless pages, she negated the autobiography that she had so meticulously written. And then Dr. Erickson explained that she had 2 children, and one of them had a name that could be a masculine name or a feminine name, and that when she was seeing the student of Dr. Erickson who he assigned her to, she would never indicate whether her child was male or female. Now that's very hard to do without using personal pronouns, but this was part of the manipulative pattern. And Dr. Erickson said one day he was in the hospital and walked around the corner, and there she was with 2 girls, and he said, "I'm sorry, this was completely unexpected." And she said, "God damn you, Dr. Erickson." And she was still manipulating for no reason other than that was her style. And eventually I even had contact with one of her children who was curious about the nature of her mother's personality. And the first 3 patients that Dr. Erickson told me about were people whose change was minimal. Now, when I went and visited Dr. Erickson, it was the end of my counterculture days. My hair was long, it was parted down the middle in a ponytail. I had work shirt, jeans, and sandals, and that's how I showed up in Dr. Erickson's office. And I was rebellious. And the first 3 stories that he told me were people who didn't change. And I remember subtly laughing to myself and saying, "Oh, I'm not like that, I change. I'm not like that, I change. I'm not like that, I change." And I can rightfully and readily assume that that was part of Dr. Erickson's orientation, was to help me to access a more open state to what it was that he was about to teach me. This is Jeff Zeig. Here I am in the offices of Phoenix, Arizona. Stories about Milton Erickson.